Hello, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Ivan Sokolov, and this is a video about double central pawns, the second one in a series. In the first one, in the game Rubinstein-Alekhine, as you have seen, we did analyze a position with the double D pawns. Here we are going to pick up a recent game between Magnus Carlsen playing with white versus Vishy and Anand, and we are going to touch the subject that we are going to deal in the number 2 and number 3 video on central double pawns. This is going to be double E pawns. And coming from actually Italian game, which is nowadays very popular, a lot of people are playing this. This game is going to have something, let's say, special. There is going to be one positional decision taken by Magnus Carlsen, which we do not see every day. In a video number 3, I will be more busy explaining the basic decisions in a double E pawns in Italian. Here we are going to have, as I said, quite interesting decision taken by Magnus, something which I did not really see before. So let's come to critical position. All those moves are common moves. Knight a3 is the latest development. In Italian, before this knight was normally going to d2, but I guess that this is just a matter of fashion. Knight e7, knight c2, bishop e3. Okay, white is changing these bishops and taking by knight. What do we have here as a position? A standard Italian situation. White is having a little bit more space. However, black position is quite reasonable. Black plays here move knight g4. Logical move. Because as I said, white is having a little bit more space. What is useful thing for you to do in the case that you have less space? Well, change a few pieces. This normally actually helps the side that is having a little bit less space. So knight g4. And now Magnus has to decide what he wants to do. Does he want to allow black to take on e3 and make him a double E pawns? Does he want himself maybe to take on g4? Does he want to go away? Does he want to protect this knight by piece so he can recapture with piece in order not to damage his pawn structure? Actually, Magnus judges that he should allow black to take on e3 and to double his pawns. So let's see the first part of Magnus' decision. He forces a capture. And now let us understand why did Magnus Carlsen do it. By allowing this capture and recapturing with a pawn, he has opened his rook. This is common situation. This pawn on e3, it should not be underestimated. In such a kind of structures, it is always having a function of controlling f4 square, so that this knight cannot jump so easily. Rook on f1 combined with the bishop on c4 and the queen that is going to come to b3 are going to exercise a pressure on pawn on f7. So this is something which Vishy will need to deal with. Those are, let's say, the basic strategic reasons behind the Magnus decision to recapture with the pawn on e3 to allow black to double his pawns on the e file. So queen e7, queen b3, c6. This move needs to be played in order to move the bishop from c8 because pawn on b7 was attacked, d4. Well, now for Vishy, in order to develop, he actually needs to double his own pawns on the e file, because how to develop this bishop? I mean, bishop needs to get developed. He needs to connect his rooks, and he plays move bishop e6 finally, which is logical move. Takes, and now what do we have? We have a pawn symmetry in the center, more or less. With white advantage, to have some small advantage, because again, white has more space. His pawn is already on d4. His pawn here advanced to a5. Queen is a little bit more active. White has some slight advantage because of more space. Rook d1, rook e8. But how to build onto this kind of advantage? Magnus here takes a very interesting strategic decision. He plays move queen b4, exercising a pressure on this a3 fa diagonal, and more or less forcing black to take a central decision. Black takes e d4. Now question is how to recapture. Obviously, he needs to recapture by a pawn. Now, e takes d4, correcting wrong pawns looks like a sensible idea. But Magnus is a world champion. He has his own ideas about this position. And he plays c takes d4. Amazing strategic decision. It was a rapid game, but nevertheless, the strategic decision behind and the depth of it is amazing. And important for the viewers to try to remember, because you can use it in your own games. I remember that I was really very impressed. I was watching the game live, and this c takes d4 really left me an impression. So what does the Magnus want? Why is he keeping his e-pawns doubled? Actually, those pawns, the advantage of it is they are controlling a lot of squares. This pawn from e3 is actually controlling f4 square, so this knight can never actually jump to f4, creating tactical possibilities. Here Anand plays a very logical move, probably the most logical. He's playing move e5, while trying to basically fix those two double pawns. In a hindsight, now actually knowing how did the game develop, move d5 actually deserves an attention. But it is easy to say it now when I know how the game finished. So e5 looks like a very logical move. And here Magnus takes another interesting decision. And the reason actually he took c takes d4 here is that he anticipated events which we are now going to see. So e5. And now Magnus continues the way he planned when he recaptured c takes d4. So let's see those few more moves. Takes, 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 takes. Okay, what did he do? Let's try to analyze this position a bit. I would say later in a third video, when I would be giving some kind of, let's say, set of rules, that in general, when one side is having double pawns, the side that is having healthier pawn structure, so not having double pawns, that for that side, it makes sense to trade a couple of pieces off. So what is Magnus doing? He's playing himself against those rules by here deciding to trade the queens. So to actually take the dynamic factor out of equation. But what did he get after trading queens? Now, let's see. Actually, those two double pawns, as we are going to see, are going to be very useful controlling important squares f4 and f5. This is going to become important. White, you may argue, is having one pawn less on a queen side, so black is, let's say, having a pawn majority. But this pawn majority of black does not really help, because actually pawn on a5 is easily controlling the two pawns. And once b4 will be pushed, two pawns are easily controlling black 3. White has an idea to transfer his knight to d2, b3 and c5. If white knight comes to c5, then black pawn on b7 is going to be very weak and is going to be a problem. Next to this, just like in his game against, let's say, Kramnik, our first video, which was video of the open file, white is controlling the open d file, and this is very important in this position. So what Magnus is doing, he is actually combining a number of strategic factors in this particular game to make it work to his benefits. So truly worthy of a world champion. And Vishy is going to have a problem to handle this position. Simply problem to find a counterplay. Rook d6 happened. And black is now going to get gradually tied up. Anand, what he doesn't like this knight on g6 doing nothing. And he doesn't like this rook being on d6. So he plays move knight h8. Willing to bring a knight to f7 in order to improve it. Well, the other move was, let's say, move like rook f6. Trying to change a pair of rooks, which is having its sense. However, next to the fact that white can actually change those rooks, forcing a pawn structure change and then drive his knight to a better square, and probably actually having some advantage, because it is not so easy for black to cause different changes, because now move knight d7 is a terrible blunder due to knight c8, hitting a rook and threatening rook d6 check. White can also decide to just go back with the rook to d2 and keep his d file dominance, or even maybe better to play move rook d3, allowing this knight to go to d2, b3, c5. So Vishy plays move knight h8, which is sensible move. I mean, he wants to bring his knight to f7, hitting this rook out. Now is actually important moment. Probably Vishy here needed to follow the rule which I gave in a third video, that the side that is having a healthier pawn structure and not having double pawns, this is what I meant by it, actually should probably try to trade some pieces off. And I think that trading a pair of rooks would have actually improved black chances to defend this position. Black is still passive, but trading a pair of rooks perhaps should work to black benefit. White will have ideas similar to the game, but I still think that with a pair of rooks on a board less, black survival chances would have increased. Vishy played move knight f7, and after rook d3 now he played move knight g5, hitting a pawn on e4, temporarily not allowing this knight from d2 to move. But now we are going to see actually the benefit, another benefit of two double pawns. Rook f5, this move is possible only because of those two double pawns. So again, bear in mind, double pawns in the center, yes, they are kind of double, and you may view it as a damaged pawn structure, but on the other hand, those pawns are controlling a lot of squares. So rook f5, h6 defending the knight, and now Magnus is hitting this knight back. And now trying to improve his own knight. Again, pay attention, this pawn is very useful pawn here, because it supports rook on f5. It is not easy for black to live with this rook on f5, and on the other hand, black doesn't want to take it because white would recapture with his pawn, improving his pawn structure. So not easy situation. Also, additional idea for white in this position is to run with his king. Just follow the green line. If this king runs all the way to b6, then the game will be finished, because simply white would start collecting black pawns. So there are a number of strategic advantages for a white in this position. Knight c6, knight c5. Black is having a problems that he is simply horribly tied up. h5 fixing a pawn structure. Black does not have actually any kind of counterplay. Perhaps here the best was waiting strategy for black, playing move like rook f8, but first of all, this is not easy decision to take, and secondly, it is not so clear that black is going to save his game, because provided that white does not, let's say, make some horrible blunder or move like king f2, because it would be terrible blunder due to knight e4 check, white can slowly improve his position, let's say g3, improving king. And now actually he can try to focus on a weak b7 pawn or improving his rook to b3. It is not easy for black to play such a kind of position. And certainly not easy to decide that by making a passive moves with the rook, black may hold the game. No, it is very difficult decision. Computer is suggesting it. For a human, it is a very hard decision and not clear if it would hold the game. King h7 was played by Vishy, also sort of a waiting strategy, but not completely, because he wants to get ready to push g6. Now problem is after a move like rook d8, that black is now completely packed. He is forced to push now his g-pawn. Black is simply here running out of moves. Compare this actually to our open file game between Carlsen with white and Kramnik with black, when Kramnik also did run out of moves. Simply, Magnus is very good at strangling positionally his opponents in such a kind of position. Here, problem for black is that he simply doesn't have a move. Rook cannot move because of knight e6. Rook cannot move to e8 because it blunders to rook f6. And if knight moves, then a problem is that after knight e6, there is no good move here, because knight f8 is a threat, and in the case of g6, black is now going to lose his knight on g4, because you can never capture on e6 because rook on f7 is hanging. So that means that Vishy is now forced to play g6, and after takes, now comes another pin. There is now a double pin, and black is again doomed to passivity. White is now just going to slowly improve his position. Check, disturbing a rook, and now comes g4. Black simply cannot move one single piece. Rook h7 is going to lose material due to knight e6, rook e8, and let's say jump, probably the most straightforward, easiest move. Takes, check, and takes. And now white is a pawn up and is having also better position, winning position, because pawn cannot be recaptured because of relatively simple tactics. And black loses his rook. So facing this very difficult situation, what Vishy here did, he pushed c5. And next move of Magnus is just underlying the hopelessness of a black position, b3. Black simply cannot make a single move. And here Vishy played move rook e8, and after knight takes b7, he resigned the position. So what we did have in this game, what is here to learn, this is actually number one, the decision of Magnus in this position to recapture by a c-pawn and not being afraid of keeping a double e-pawns. And then situation number two is to understand that such a kind of ending, should you ever get one, is actually very difficult for black. Pay attention that if this pawn on a6 would have had been on a7, the whole situation would be very different, because black will be able to play move b6, eliminate b7 pawn weakness, and prevent knight from coming to c5. The situation as such is heavily favoring white. D-file extremely important. Without the D-file control, also the situation would have had been very different. So this game is just combination of different strategic elements, masterfully played by the world champion. And I hope that this video was useful. And now in a third video, I will more focus on, let's say, most standard positions coming from a double E pawns from Italian. Thank you.